It's Wednesday, June 28th, 2023. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the University of Georgia's Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies. I'm here today in the Bob Shore Oral History Studio with Dr. Steve Wrigley. He is, of course, the 13th Chancellor of the University System of Georgia, position he held from 2017 until his retirement in July 2021. Prior to becoming Chancellor, he served as Executive Vice Chancellor of Administration from 2011 to 2017. Here at the University of Georgia, Dr. Wrigley held several posts over the years, including Director of the Carl Vinson Institute of Government, Vice President for Government Relations, and Senior Vice President for External Affairs. Of course, Dr. Wrigley spent a number of years in state government, including almost 8 as Senior Executive Assistant and Chief of Staff to Governor Zell Miller. He's also spent time in the legislative branch, working as Senior Policy Analyst in the Senate Research Office. Born in Kansas, he grew up in Cobb and Douglas counties before earning his bachelor's degree from Georgia State University and his PhD in history from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Dr. Wrigley, Steve, thank you so much for taking some time this morning and this afternoon, depending on how long we talk, to talk about your career in state government and politics. Really do appreciate you being here.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So I wonder, let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your childhood and upbringing. You were the son of a government employee who moved around quite a bit. So tell me how you got settled here in Georgia.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, my dad was a career Navy man, enlisted in the Navy out of high school, became a Navy pilot, one of the few enlisted men that did that. In fact, for a while after that, you couldn't do that, and then they changed that law. But anyway, and he met my mother and got married, and they started having a family, and so he got out of the Navy and went to work for the Federal Aviation Administration. My mom stayed at home for a while, then became a civil employee at Fort McPherson.
Okay.
So both of my parents were public servants, and we grew up in kind of that culture and set of values. Both were very interested in current affairs, and that was the early to mid-'60s, and they read a lot, and that was when you actually got a newspaper delivered to your home and you read it, and we were always encouraged to read. And
sometimes twice a day.
That's sometimes twice a day, yeah. We were always encouraged to read that, and we had encyclopedias and all that sort of thing. So there was just, we had a lot of encouragement to pay attention and be involved and be aware. Mm-hmm. Not, from like an activist standpoint, but that's what citizens do, You do your part, and you go to work, and you pay your taxes, and you pay attention, and you vote. And so we lived in South Cobb County at the time, and that was a part of the state 100 years before was at war, and so there was that air of history around the place, and so I developed an interest in history at the time, and we later moved to Douglas County, which is where I went to high school and graduated.
Right. So when you went to Georgia State, did you consider other universities? Did you consider University of Georgia or consider going out of state? How'd that come about?
Not really. It was just at a time at the high school I went to the county was growing, and they were behind building schools. High school was in double sessions. It just wasn't what I would call an academic setting and culture, and it wasn't promoted much. And I was just sort of happy to get out of there. We were a comfortable middle-class family. I had 2 older brothers, but we didn't have the resources for me to go off and do too much from a college standpoint. So I decided to go to Georgia State and commute and work my way through, which is what I did. So I went to school, sometimes part-time, sometimes full-time, and I worked. So I had a job in my entire time at Georgia State.
What were you doing? What was your job?
I initially worked at a place called Richmond Dry Goods on Fulton Industrial Boulevard, which I had started working in high school, and that's again in the days when there were textile manufacturers, and this was the middleman, and it was Buster Brown's children's wear and different things, and so I filled orders, and then after that I went to work for UPS.
Okay.
They had a facility at Fulton Industrial, they made steel, and I loaded trucks.
Oh yeah.
On the midnight shift, midnight sort they called it, at UPS, which was a great experience in many ways. And then I went to work. I had a job at IBM. I had a they had a building out near Cumberland Mall that I worked at, just doing security on a second shift. So that was a little easier job, and I got to wear a suit. And
there you go.
So that kept me, that kept me being able to live and pay my tuition and that sort of thing. So
Now, were you studying history? Was that your?
I started off. Wasn't sure, thought maybe business, then I thought about criminal justice, thought like everybody, maybe I'll go to law school. And I had a wonderful professor. I took a political science class named Bill Thomas and William R. Thomas, who we were talking one day, and I told him I think I want to go to law school, and he just looked at me and he said, "You're going to be bored to death if you go to law school, and you ought to think about this." And I had a wonderful history professor, John Michael Matthews, who sort of took me under his wing, and he sort of guided me toward graduate school in history. So those two guys made a big difference in my life and sort of helped me understand how to take thinking and the academic world in a serious way. And it really made a difference in what I wound up doing.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about your graduate research and work, but as I understand it, you actually interned at the state capitol.
I did.
Your senior year?
Yeah, that was when we were on the quarter system.
Right.
And I wound up needing 10 hours to graduate, I should paint this as some deep strategy, but I needed 10 hours in political science as my minor to graduate. And so a legislative internship was 10 hours, and so I did a legislative internship that spring, winter, whatever we called it, that January to March quarter in 1981. And Bill Thomas was the advisor, and so he, encouraged me to do that, and so I did that, and that's when I met a lot of people, and I worked for State Senator Steve Reynolds that was who I was assigned to, and it was great fun. I enjoyed it, and it was sort of history come to life for me.
So Steve Reynolds, this is the Steve Reynolds where if you take the exit, you can't get back on to 280.
That's right. That is named for the state senator I worked for.
That was my introduction to Steve Reynolds, was taking that exit and not being able to get back onto 85.
I've done that myself. Yeah, he was chair of the Senate Transportation Committee.
Well, there you go. There you go. A very influential post, especially in those days. Especially in those days. I assume that's where you met Zell Miller for the first time, probably.
I did, but really in passing.
Yeah.
He was obviously lieutenant governor.
Sure.
Had just come off that bruising Senate race in 1980.
Yeah.
So we met him a time or two, but I didn't really get to know him until later, after I went to work in Senate research.
You mentioned sort of briefly how this wasn't clearly a grand strategy on your part. Was this something that after you got through that quarter, you're like, hey, this is something I might actually like to do, or is that something that just developed later through happenstance, like so many of our careers?
Well, you're right. Careers are happenstance, but in many ways. No, it really piqued my interest, and I at that point I had been admitted a number of history graduate schools, and I decided to go to Northwestern, and I was going to stick with that. But I graduated then from Georgia State in March of 1981, and needed something to do, and so I got between then and September when I went off to Northwestern, and Steve Reynolds picked up the phone and called the DOT commissioner and got me a job over there for Tom Moreland. For 5 or 6 months, and there was a special session of the General Assembly to do reapportionment and to rewrite the state constitution. So I kind of had a front row seat sitting there listening to all those meetings and such, and that was kind of fun. But
good perspective for 1991.
It was, and actually, DOT, Tom Moreland, he had his own reapportionment plans, congressional reapportionment plans.
That doesn't surprise me in the least.
Yeah, and so I was in the middle of fiddling around with all that stuff. I had no idea what I was doing. But
you got to be, and you were front and center You were in the background for Hal Reeves and that sort
all of that too later. Yeah, very much so. But all that just really piqued my interest, and actually DOT, they wanted me to stay, and I thought no, and so I went off to Northwestern, which was a great experience, and I'm glad I did it. But all of that sort of the legislative internship and that time at DOT, thought it's kind of interesting to be a part of history in a different way, not just read it and write it, but participate in a front row way. So
are you one of those unique odd graduate students that knew exactly what they wanted to research and write when they went
No.
to grad? Okay,
No.
all right. So so I can speak to you normally.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what was that experience like going from Georgia up to Evanston? You know, I'm from Illinois, but I'm from the southern part.
Oh,
I'm from right outside Carbondale.
That's a different country.
That is that is a different world.
Yeah.
Culturally.
Yeah, yeah, very much
politically
so.
at the time, although it's flipped now. What was that like, and how did you come upon your dissertation topic that you ended up writing?
It was a great experience, and it was because I'd grown up here in the Atlanta area, and you know, my parents were great. We traveled a good bit, and so you know, we'd been all over the country. But it was, you know, there was still enough of a fascination with the South and Georgia in ways that people, you know, I was born in Kansas, but people were just, I had this heavy accent, you know, and people were fascinated by it and thought there were still plantations and such, you know. But that was really a minor component of it. The program at Northwestern was very small. There were only, in the American history part of it, there were only 7 or 8 of us.
Wow.
Maybe 9. There weren't very many in the first year class.
Yeah. Okay.
First year class, and you know how it is. The first year, I mean, your head's down, and that's what you're doing. So
It's like being a parent for the first year. It's just
yeah, it's all consuming, and so that's what we did, and we all got to know one another and became friends, and there were people from all over the country, but you know, from different institutions. But that's really where the focus was. I don't remember any kind of big stark transformation where I felt like a fish out of water at all. Right. But Evanston, Chicago, is, you know, it's different. I mean, you know, if I'd gone to the Northeast, maybe it would have been different. But
yeah.
I mean, the thing I remember more than anything else is the transition in weather.
Yes.
That's what sticks with me.
Yes.
Because it was, you know, cold and snowy, and you just don't have that here. So.
Yeah, and gray.
And gray.
And gray.
Yeah.
The sun. There are weeks at a time where the sun doesn't shine.
Yeah.
And that is. I don't miss that.
Yeah,
I don't miss that.
I don't either. And remember getting, you know, 8 or 10 inches of snow in the middle of April, and down here the azaleas are blooming. So
Exactly.
That's what sticks out with me more than anything is that transition around weather, which was fun. I wouldn't want to do it now. But
Right. Now we actually have to go out and work and do things.
Right. Right.
So your dissertation was on public life in Georgia, the triumph of provincialism.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you were looking at primarily the sort of post-populist progressive era, the Robert Wiebe search for order kind of era, or rage for order, if we're talking Joel Williamson. What drew you to that time period and that topic?
You know, it's sort of coming back to my first interest. My Northwestern was structured. You didn't do a master's degree, a master's thesis. You did a first-year paper, and that's kind of how they weeded people out of the program.
It's actually not a bad idea.
To be, you know,
not a bad idea.
Crass about it. So the first year is a race, you know, as you know, and they were on quarter system, and I had gotten
quarter system in grad school. Oh
yeah,
no.
it was quarter system.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and so it was a rush. But I fell in with the colonial historian there named Tim Breen.
T.H. Breen.
T.H. Breen. Good guy, very supportive of grad students, brilliant man, and I got to know him very well. Did some painting at his house outside, you know, and got to know his family.
That is the quintessential. Are you really a grad student if you haven't done side jobs for the faculty?
Yeah, and he actually paid us, you know, so.
It's more than I can say for some.
But I wound up doing my first year paper on a early Republic piece about the courts and such, and you know, just sort of struggle with it. And it wasn't a very good paper, but they let me through anyway. And so I just sort of, in my second year and beyond, thought I'm going to go back to what really, you know, I enjoy, and trying to figure out what all this stuff is about, and the place where I grew up. And that period of history always sort of fascinated me. The post-war, early 20th century. Because it seemed unsettled, and I didn't really think anybody had it figured out. I'm not sure we still have it figured out. But there was a guy at Northwestern at the time named George Fredrickson who left, but he and I talked about that sort of a topic around that, and there was a sort of battle between people who believed there was a progressive era in the South and those who didn't believe it, and
Dewey Grantham, Bill Link.
yeah, and I just sort of, I don't know, I think I came away with an impression, having been in and around the Capitol, that that the threads of conservatism and the rural influence remain much stronger, maybe than some of the progressive
the
felt
Tyndall,
like. So
darkness at the dawning. And,
so that's kind of what.
that may have been Kirby. Neither here nor there. Sorry,
Yeah,
thinking out loud.
I've
That may have
forgotten
been Jack
all those.
Temple Kirby. Yeah, right. Well, I'm a little bit closer to my comprehensive exam reading list than you are.
Yeah. So that's what it was. It was just sort of first interests, and it still interests me.
Yeah.
I still read around in that period of history, the late 19th, early 20th century, because it's just such a time of dramatic change on every level.
So I was looking at the start date is 1898. Was that because of the white primary?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And
then 1917 will be the Neal Primary Act.
Yeah, just it was sort of, it's a very traditional dissertation and structured that way, and
Makes perfect sense.
And just sort of separate it from the immediate Civil War era and Reconstruction era, because I do think there was a departure at that point because the economy was changing so much.
Oh, sure, exactly.
And had changed so much by then.
Which is, of course, what we document here at the Russell Library. I have to get that plug in there.
Absolutely.
So how did you go from graduate student, sort of what we would call a traditional graduate student up in Evanston, to working as a research analyst in the Georgia State Senate? Walk me through that.
Sure. Again, did you use the word happenstance about careers?
Yes.
I think,
Yeah.
And so I was.
Two history PhDs sitting here, neither of whom are professors. So that's
Well,
here we are.
So we can speak shorthand, but I received a dissertation year fellowship from Northwestern. So I had the year off to do research and work on my dissertation, which was terrific.
Yeah.
And so I moved back to Atlanta and started doing research, and wandered around in the archives and all that stuff for a while, and finally got some focus. And I was in the state capitol one day, and ran into my old buddy Dan Ebersol, who was head of the Senate Research Office, and that would have been sometime in the probably spring and summer of '85. And we just got to chit-chatting, and they had a position open, and I needed a job as I was finishing my dissertation, so there's the happenstance part. So he said, come in. And so I wound up going to work there in the fall of '85 and finished my dissertation while in my first year I was working in Senate research.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah.
But
Well, it was, but Dan was very supportive, and he understood the value of me finishing it and gave me a lot of latitude.
Great.
And basically said, take a writing Friday, every Friday you need it. And so he was very supportive, very helpful.
it takes a village.
It takes a village. And the way the workflow was, it's intense in December through April, and then it sort of, and I was pretty determined to try to get it done in '86, and I did. So. But I just, it was sort of happenstance.
So tell me, had you planned for a career in academia, or was that something that, like me, I always wanted to be a teaching professor, and then over time it's like, I don't know. And you search out other opportunities.
Well, I was finishing my dissertation, and I got this job at Senate Research, which I enjoyed. It was just a policy job. I mean, because we were as analysts, we were assigned to committees, and I got the insurance committee, and I learned well more about auto insurance than I ever wanted to. But I met a fellow named Nathan Deal as a state senator at that time. So, I was doing that work, but I applied for a couple academic jobs. I revised my dissertation. I submitted it to North Carolina Press, LSU Press, and one of them had a recommendation to publish. I forget which one it was. You think LSU or North Carolina? But that was probably by then '88 or so.
Yeah.
And I'd just gone to work for Zell Miller. And those two didn't match up. Working for him, getting ready to mount a campaign for governor, and trying to, because the dissertation needed it needed a lot of work to get in publishable form, and I just thought I'm on a path now, and I enjoy it and I like it, and so I've always had this sort of twinge of gosh, maybe I could have been an academic. You never know. So
Well, yeah. I think it probably worked out for you.
Yeah, no, I've
One
enjoyed
way or
it.
another.
I've enjoyed it, but I've never lost my affection for history, and I still read a lot of it and enjoy it.
And of course, Governor Miller was
very
same
much
way,
so. Yeah,
his whole life.
Yeah, very much so, and I think that informed a lot of how he thought about things.
So when you were in the Senate Research Office, for the uninitiated, what is the Senate Research Office, and why?
Yeah.
Why does it exist?
Yeah, and it has changed over time.
Sure.
But at that time, and I believe that Zell Miller established it as a way to have professional staff provide professional analysis and background work on policy. There is a legislative counsel's office that serves both houses of the General Assembly. And I think Lieutenant Governor Miller felt like that's a legal perspective, but we need a broader look at the policy issues. And so he built the office. Dan was, I don't know if he's first director, but he was director for a long time. And so its purpose is to provide just background policy, nonpartisan analysis for members of both parties. And so, as I said, the analysts were assigned to committees. And I had public safety and insurance and natural resources, and I forget, that might have been the three I had.
So you got to learn a lot about a lot.
Yeah, and it was great fun. You became a generalist about a lot of things. You got to meet, Hugh Gillis was the chair of natural resources.
Insurance, Paul Coverdell would have been.
He was involved in that, and he would
have been leader at the time.
Yeah, he was more involved in pension stuff, which I forget because he was big into pension reform, and frankly probably saved the Georgia pension systems. But
as a TRS member, this is important.
Yeah. So it was just great fun. I learned a lot about a lot of things. No-fault insurance. I mean, it was just really, and you just really learned from the inside out how a legislative body works.
Right.
And
the stuff that the public doesn't really see.
Yeah, and don't really gain an appreciation for, and just how the vast majority of those elected folks, they're good people. They care about what they do. They're trying to figure this stuff out. They're in a rush like everybody else, dealing with complicated stuff, and then all the layers of politics that go with that. So I learned a lot about a lot of things, and learned a lot about people, and it was a wonderful experience.
So in your role as an analyst, assigned to the committees, were there sort of cross currents or countervailing pressures from the governor's Senate floor leaders, the lieutenant governor's office, the minority leader's office or was that something that just it didn't affect you as a nonpartisan analyst?
No, you had to be aware of it. Really not so much from the governor's office. Now, if the executive branch got wind of something you were working on, you'd get a phone call, from OPB or the agency, and we worked a lot with agency staff.
Okay.
And got to know them, and they generally tried to be helpful and supportive, and frankly, a lot of times they could, they would head you off from, that's a really stupid idea. That's a bad, and sometimes
That's not going in the budget. You can just stop.
Well, and it was just, we've tried that, or there's a federal law, because we were all generalists, and in some cases didn't know as much. And then sometimes you always had to be a little suspicious, like, well, they say it's a bad idea because they don't want to do it, So you kind of had to learn what was what with that. But yeah, occasionally you'd interact some with the governor's office. It really wasn't so much a partisan thing because at the time, there were 8 or 9 Republican senators, and they sort of knew the numbers, and they were sensible. And you could work with them, and they tried to be helpful, and there wasn't a lot of partisan clashing in tension because it just didn't.
Right, it was more of an ideological, geographic divide.
That and just personality driven too. A lot of it, just a lot of Georgia
Characters.
history.
Characters.
Yes, just more around that and jockeying for who's going to run statewide next and that sort of thing. So I don't remember a lot of tension around that. Most of it would have been around senators that don't like each other as opposed to something partisan.
We could do a whole interview, I'm sure, on that conversation or the relationship with the House and the Senate and the Speaker and Speaker Murphy and everything. So you're in Senate research, and you talked about gearing up for Lieutenant Governor Miller's governor's race. How did you get? Because heretofore, Zell Miller's sort of this figure over here who's running the Senate, and it doesn't look like you have a personal day-to-day relationship with the LG. You work mainly with Dan Ebersol. And is that how you then got plugged in to sort of the Miller team, or how did that work?
It really came about because I was staffing the Natural Resources Committee through the Mountain Protection Act that North Georgia was
near and dear to Governor Miller.
Yeah, North Georgia was changing. There was rampant development and unbridled development, and little zoning and a little regard to any sort of effort to try to protect what was drawing people up there and fueling the development. And there were some laws in some other states he had become interested in, and then Georgia had done a few things with the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act of 1970. Yeah, that one and a couple others, and so there were other things with a soil conservation thing. Anyway, so I got assigned because I was the committee staffer. I got assigned to it, and I'd been there at the time a year. I didn't really know any better, so I started doing the research, and I told him what I thought and gave him my opinion, and we just kind of hit it off and got along well, and that really led to us that would have been 86 and then 87, I guess, that developing a relationship. And then a woman, Dan Ebersol's wife, Sarah Eby Ebersol, worked for him, and she was leaving to go, I guess, to Georgia Tech, as I recall, because she had young kids to raise, and so he asked me to join his staff in 1988. Because we had gotten to know one another around working together on the Mountain Protection Act.
So what was your role on the LG staff?
I think I was called executive assistant, and it was
there's that term.
Yeah, and it was a small staff. I did a little bit of everything. I wrote a few speeches, tried to manage the office. If he had legislation, I would be the one to sort of put that together and help manage that through. He was very hands-on and had been there so long, had such strong relationships with all the individual senators, and
for better and for worse.
Yeah, and so he, I just did a little bit of everything, and then that's how I got to know the people on the campaign side. When he asked me to join him, because I joined him in, I think, May of '88. He literally was like within a week or two announcing for governor they're running 90. And so that was all known amongst us, and so I knew that was where that was headed. So I was to sort of keep that pulled together. And I didn't really get drawn much into the campaign until a little bit after hours and all, but it was because it was all about fundraising at the time. There wasn't a lot of substantive work around policy and such until the next year, '89 was when that started. So.
Right, the shadow primary.
Right.
So, and of course, you never had any campaign experience apart from, I don't know, maybe you did some in college or
I'd never,
here or there. I don't know.
No, I'd never.
So what was the transition like from policy and governance to to campaigning. You went from prose to poetry, as they say. The politics is poetry and governing is prose. What was that transition like, going from state government to a campaign?
Yeah, again, it's another. I don't remember it as being sort of abrupt and jarring. It was fun and interesting, and because I worked in the lieutenant governor's office and had done had been immersed in policy stuff. That was really sort of, once I got pulled into the campaign, where I was relied on, among others, to focus on. And then ultimately we were all sort of pitching in around the politics and polling and all that stuff. But it was, campaigns were different then, and it ebbs and flows throughout the history of the country, as you know. And there was a real effort around, okay, we've got to be for something. We've got to articulate policies that we are for.
What a novel concept.
Yeah,
right?
and why it matters and why we're for it and why it makes a difference to people. And Zell was devoted to that, and the campaign team was, Keith was, and they all knew this is what we've got to do. We not only have to sort of tell and retell his personal story, but what is it he's about? Why should he, you got to answer that question, why should he be the governor?
Right.
And so, we spent a lot of time around the substantive issues of, you need to grab that?
Yeah.
That's, we spent a lot of time around the substantive issues and policy. And Zell was he was an idea engine, and was constantly churning out things because he read widely and he. And had yellow legal pads that he just kept with him all the time.
They're down in the vault.
Oh, good, because and so he cared about all that stuff very, very deeply, and it really mattered to him. Substantive things really mattered to him.
Well, you talk about being for something, and you talked about how Zell had been in the public eye in Georgia, I guess you could say, since 1962. When he entered the state senate, but especially since '74,
right? Yeah, very much so.
As LG. How did you, the campaign, Bagala, Carville, Keith, the rest of the campaign, how were you able to package Zell Miller as this sort of change candidate, even though he was this long-serving household name in Georgia that, at first glance, doesn't strike you as much of a change candidate?
Yeah. No, exactly, and that was I think that was front and center among the campaign thinkers, and but one of Zell's strengths was he wasn't seen as part of the quote old guard, fairly or unfairly, maybe like Tom Murphy was, and his sort of conflicts. With Murphy helped sort of separate him from what maybe people perceived as a Democratic Party that was old in the 1950s and backward, and so that helped a little. But part of it, but the way how to do it was, what is he going to be for?
Right.
And so the lottery was a big part of that. I mean, because that's different, and it scared a lot of people.
Right.
And that just sort of helped define him right away. But then other things too, some positions on education and environment that were just different and didn't come across as the guy who's been in and around state government 30 years in one form or another, 25 years. These are the kinds of things he's for, which were quite a departure. On whatever issue you've named, his positions they weren't radical. They were just a little step, a little step. At that time, in the way we would understand the word progressive, maybe not now we would understand the word progressive.
Right, and especially considering sort of the latter part of his public life in the Senate. For example.
So that was a lot of it, but there was also stuff he was for. I mean, it was his idea to pursue the lottery, and he cared just passionately about education, and that was how he was going to fund the things he wanted to do in education. So, and it was really a counter to some of the other candidates, and I think that was what really helped him in the primary.
So I think one of the misnomers about Zell Miller and the '90 campaign is that it was all about the Hope Scholarship, and it was, but you know, I guess you would have been, you know, right in the thick of, I think it was called the Blueprint for the 1990s.
Yeah,
or sort of
something like that. Yeah.
What you know, that you've enumerated some of those other issues
Right.
that I think the ones that get remembered are maybe, you know, the tough on crime, the boot camps, which were very much of the time
Yeah.
in the 80s, 90s. You know, the last great crime wave,
Right,
really.
right.
You know, comparing statistics between crime now and crime then was way worse. So, you know, it's one of those things that, you know, knowing history helps.
Right, right.
So, what do you remember about the one-term pledge? If there was one, how that came about,
Well,
and why?
There was, and it predated me, but I think it was after the '86 elections, I believe, and he'd been reelected as lieutenant governor. And then there immediately began speculation who's going to run for governor in '90, because obviously Governor Harris was
As these things do.
terminated. And I think it might have been over here at the Biennial Institute. He was asked about it, and I love the man to this day. And he would, you know, he could just sometimes be a little too cute when he was talking to the press. And it was a very different media world then too. And I think he just kind of said, well, if I run, you know, I'll only serve one term. But you know, it was just never that big a deal. It was never anything we had to deal with that much. I don't recall it really being an issue at all in the '90 race. I don't think he believed it, and I don't think any of the media believed it.
Right.
You know,
And based on '94 results, I don't think
Yeah,
it was
and-
really held against him.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody really cared in the end. And the state was changing so much,
Right.
and had been changing for 15 years, you know, in terms of demographics and such. So I just don't remember that as a, you know, and those kind of things, you know, I forget even really how we dealt with it. I think Carville and Bagala, they didn't really worry too much about it.
Right.
So, you know, it wasn't that big of a thing, as I recall.
You talked about the primary opponents, and you had sort of, you know, these representatives of the different factions of the Democratic Party. You had, you know, Bubba McDonnell, who would have been the speaker.
Yeah.
It's possibly unfair to Bubba McDonnell to call him simply the speaker's candidate, but
Yeah,
that's how he was seen and understood.
And that's how he saw it, I think.
Right.
I think he'd tell you that, yeah.
And then Andy Young, which Mayor Young, sort of the Atlanta African American establishment candidate. Roy Barnes, who was, you know, the Cobb County, the suburban candidate, and then Lester Maddox, who was just Lester being Lester,
Yeah.
I guess. You know, one last backward bicycle ride for posterity, I guess. So tell me about the primary approach and how you tried to differentiate yourself, and who you saw as the competition, or if you were just going to run your race and let the chips fall where they may.
You know, I think initially, and I'm sure Keith spoke to this, but I think initially, you know, probably thought, well, you know, Roy Barnes is somebody we, you know, may have to worry about, and maybe Bubba, but you know, they did such a great job. I say they, Virgil and Keith, and raising money. They quickly, you know, separated themselves from Bubba and on that. So, you know, I think, you know, during '89 and such, I think there was some thought that Roy Barnes would be a threat. But then as it developed, and he developed his positions, you know, and we were looking at polling. I think we sort of felt like pretty quickly he's not gonna take off, you know, and probably could have, because he could have been that sort of younger counter to the older, you know, Zell, and maybe to some extent older Andy. You know, he'd been around a long time, been in the public eye a long time. And I think he and Zell were about the same age, so
And they would have entered the public eye around the same time.
yeah. So, but I remember, and I think Barnes learned a lot. I think he'd tell you he learned a lot from that '90 race. I remember James once said about him, he's trying to be the candidate of the Sierra Club and the pro-life crowd, and it's not going to work. And it didn't work, you know. And he was this sort of younger guy and suburban, and you know, and he was against the lottery, and adamantly, fully against the lottery. And I think he was sort of stuck between is it 1982 or is it 1998? What am I doing here? And so never quite figured that out. And I think that's one reason why he just never really separated himself. And
Right.
so, as the primary sailed along, I mean, by April or May, we were pretty confident. We weren't arrogant about it. We weren't overconfident, but I think we knew we'd be in a runoff.
So you were always expecting a runoff.
Yeah,
with
that,
those candidates.
Yeah, we broke 40, which I think was a little surprise to all, maybe not, and I think Andy got 28 or something like that, and so we, by the time primary time rolled around in mid-July, I think we pretty well knew we were going to be in a runoff and to be in a runoff with Andy. And we're pretty confident that we would win that.
Was there a change in approach or tone when it was head-to-head between Zell Miller, North Georgia, establishment white politician versus Andy Young, sort of pillar of the African-American establishment, or was that?
No, and in fact, if anything, and this was the genius of Keith and Carvel and all of them, we were attentive to the fact we weren't going to be sensitive to the fact that, and Andy and Zell were friends. But in April, during the primary, before in like April of 1990, Zell went out and made a speech about crime and needed to be tougher on crime and attacked Andy Young, which was, a pretty risky thing to do, particularly when you got the AJC, which is knee-jerk about all things, But it was a very carefully crafted speech, data-driven, about his record on public safety issues, and so we didn't really change anything in terms of the approach. And the Democratic primary is very different than the primary it is now.
Sure.
And so, we felt pretty confident, and Zell kept talking about the same things. I mean, that was really the important thing. You get a message and you stick with it, and you constantly stick with it, and you don't change. And so that's what he did. And I think, and Andy's a brilliant guy, and ran, I think, a decent race, a credible race. Never really had a strong message, and probably had a somewhat shaky record as mayor on some issues. But is also a wonderful ambassador for the city and the state, but that wasn't enough, I think, for him to convince people. He really was a credible candidate to be governor at that point.
Right. So, were you always, or the campaign always, expecting to run against Johnny Isakson? As I recall, that wasn't much of a primary challenge for Johnny in 90.
I think we sort of assumed that's who it would be against, and I'll tell you, I mean, that was where our worry was the general more than the primary.
Which is sort of counterintuitive for a Democrat of that time.
But if you looked at data and you looked at polling, I mean, I remember it was Carvel, who is a genius, was early on, and certainly by midsummer and after we had the nomination, he was quite concerned about mainly being held under 50 because of this, way Georgia does its general election. And it's like, we get held under 50 because there was going to be a libertarian, and very concerned about that. And I think we wound up getting 53 or something.
And that concern was borne out in 92.
Yeah.
The very next
absolutely.
election.
Yeah, because the data was there. The state had changed beginning in the 60s with people moving in and people moving around in the state.
Right.
All that, and made a big difference. And it was showing up. It was showing up in that campaign year. It was showing up in the polling data. And that was the worry, was the general election. 'Cause we never thought we were going to get 60. We didn't think we'd break 55. We at no point thought it was going. We never thought it was going to be a runaway, Miller beats Isaacs in 60-40. We never thought that.
Is that because you could do the math and you knew how many people lived in the donut at the time?
Yeah, that, and you look at polling and you just knew. And the Republican Party at the time really was sort of, had cast itself as the party of something new and different. And we're not like, Tom Murphy and all those Democrats. We're something different and more progressive, and
it was a much more professional party than it had been prior to sort of Paul Coverdell and Fred Cooper and Bob Bell and Jay Morgan and all the
Yeah, no, very
all the
much
names
so.
that we know
Yeah,
now.
very much so, and so that was. I mean, I think we were confident, but still we didn't take it for granted at all.
Right.
It was touch and go.
So how did the campaign, Carville, Begala, and then the staff within the campaign assess sort of the strengths and weaknesses of Johnny as a candidate, and try to exploit those or play down some of the strengths?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, obviously, we stuck to our positive message around what Zell was going to do as governor.
Right.
And
That was the
you
primary
always,
thing.
yeah, and so that it was still around lottery and all the other issues that you know about. So that was sort of one prong of it. But then the other thing was, you've got to sort of take the shine off of Isaacson being new and different and fresh and progressive and
Just a nice guy.
he is a nice guy.
Yeah.
He was my friend. He was Zell's friend, and I think the world of the man. He was a great public servant, and I knew him very well, and Zell did, and they were very close friends. But part of it was, well, he's not really what he claims to be. You have to, and so you have to sort of undermine that and raise questions about, well, whose side is he really on? And he's got these real estate interests, and he's got these other kinds of interests, and so that's just what you have to do is he says he's this, but is he really that? And that's what I recall as kind of the main thing, is trying to undermine that, not in a personal way, but in a this is what he's done, and this is what he does do, and these are his business interests, and this is what it means, and that sort of thing.
So were you? I assume you were at the temple for the debate there.
I didn't go to that one. I didn't go to all of them. I'm trying to remember now, but I didn't go to that one.
If you're like me, you get too nervous during debates anyway, so you just pace.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember why I didn't go. We didn't all often go to these things. I went to some of them, but the televised debates, most of us would stay at the headquarters and watch them on television. Uh-huh. And just a couple people. Zell didn't like a big crowd around him. He didn't want an entourage. So, Paul would go. Keith would probably go to some of them.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember, but I didn't go. I went to some, but not many. More so in '94 than '90.
So, I mean, this is taking a step back to be more of a sort of meta Zell question. But was Zell one of those guys, what you saw is what you got, or was there Zell's public persona, and then he was different behind the scenes? Or Johnny Carson, for example. Here's a metaphor. Johnny Carson was always on when the camera was on. When the camera was off, he was quiet. He wanted to save all his energy and bandwidth for the job and for the public-facing element. Was that Zell, or was that? Give me the behind the scenes.
Yeah, he's pretty much what you see is what you get. Okay. I mean, he didn't change a lot. He'd been in it a long time, so he was pretty comfortable. And but a lot of doubts about his ability to, make that '90 campaign and make it effectively, because he'd kind of made a hash of the 1980 campaign, and he knew it. And so he had some self-consciousness about that. But that was more around, I've got to remain disciplined and focused and those sorts of things. But no, he didn't. He was sort of what you see, what you get. A pretty straightforward guy, and very, very bright, well-read, loved to read, but not complicated, about a lot of stuff, and didn't complicate things. And was not a different person one place to the next. That just wasn't, Now he's like any, if it's just you and him in the room talking about stuff, he doesn't turn on the politician's charm, because it's work,
Right.
You're working. And he could turn it on and did, but he's pretty much what you see is what you get. There wasn't anything about him that was sort of an artifice or contrived.
So thinking back to election night, 1990, and we have some of the photographs here at the library, and there's Begala sitting on these twin beds or wherever, and everybody's watching the TV and watching the. Tell me about your perspective on election night and what you were expecting, and the realization that this is going to be a thing. And
well, it's interesting about it. I guess it was the Friday before the Tuesday November election. That's when you kind of do your last poll. At least that then is when you did it. The technology is also different now. And it looked really good for us. I mean, we were polling, a couple of points above 50. Carville was like, I remember he said to me, "How does it feel to know you're going to win?"
Ugh.
That was the Friday before, and the polling
Some
was
confidence.
well, the polling was that good.
That's also something that's changed.
Yes, and a lot of that is cell phones, and it's a lot of things
Right.
that go into that. And he wasn't being arrogant about it either.
But he was just confident.
Yeah, you just he'd run a lot of races, and you could look and see, and so we all felt really pretty good. In the early, you look at the returns coming in, and you get a little nervous because you got to break 50. But we'd been thinking about a transition, well before then. You have to. You have to. I mean, you just don't think about it. Start thinking about it the Wednesday after the election. And Keith and Virgil in particular had been thinking a lot about it and had done some work. Virgil had done quite a bit of work. And Keith, had some notebooks, and you pretty quickly, it was fun and it was exciting, but I was still pretty young, and you don't really grasp maybe the life-changing nature of a moment like that, and you quickly turn. We were, Wednesday morning by 7 or 7:30, we were in meetings about the transition.
Because
ready
you
to go
and
to
Keith
work.
oversaw.
We were co-deputies, I think. of the
Co-deputies.
I think that's what it was. I'm trying to remember, but I think that's what it was.
Layers
yeah.
of bureaucracy already.
Right. Well, I think that was an effort to,
Yeah.
And it never bothered either one of us. I think it was sort of an effort because I'd been executive assistant in the office, and Keith was the main guy in the campaign to sort of balance that out. But
Sure. Sure. So, tell me about that transition. I'm sure everybody's experience is different. If Rogers was sitting down telling about his experience with the Nathan Deal transition in 10 and 11, it would be different. But what was your experience like in 90 to 91?
An enormous amount of work. Because Zell had waited a long time for this.
Right.
And we had a big agenda for that 1991 session. The budget was in a mess. The economy was in the toilet.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And so there was a lot, and there was a lot to do. And he had a big agenda on a lot of fronts. And so we had to put a staff together. We had to, put a legislative agenda together. We had to, begin and reach out and develop all the relations all over again among members of the General Assembly. The transition of moving them into the mansion and moving into the Capitol, and there's a whole lot of moving pieces to it. You've got to put together an inauguration, an inaugural party, and so and that all starts, the first Wednesday in November, and you've got to be ready by the second Monday in January. Through the holidays, so it's a rush. I mean, it was a lot of work, and we worked out of the Georgia Pacific Building, what was then the Georgia Pacific Building, and we began budget hearings, and as well as like I said, all the things that we had to do. So it was just a lot of nonstop work. That's what I remember. It was fun. It was stimulating, and you really felt like you were part of something bigger than yourself, which is how Zell made you feel. That's how he approached it.
Right.
So it was a lot of fun, but it's pretty tiring.
Right. So once you make that transition and you're in place, Keith is chief of staff, you're senior executive assistant. Walk me through the differences between those two. Is that the difference between chief of staff and senior counselor in the White House? What's the difference?
Well, and it was a little bit of a, and if you talk to Virgil and Keith, they were. Keith should have been chief of staff, and there was when we first talked about it with Virgil, and I think it might have been Keith, I don't remember, about what my role would be. There was some, I think they felt like they needed to be a little tender, and I just said, look, there was this initial talk of maybe having some sort of co-thing. I just said, somebody's got to be in charge and make Keith the chief of staff, and I was fine. And so the senior executive assistant role, basically, I was sort of the policy guy.
Okay.
And
Okay.
Keith did, and I think Virgil sort of described it as Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside, and Keith outside, me inside, you know. But it was more, my role was really the policy role, and being involved in the budget, developing the legislative agenda, working with our wonderful legislative counsel, Cynthia Wright, and dealing with all the political stuff relative to the General Assembly and many of the state agencies. Some of them, Keith dealt with some of that too. But
So in West Wing terms, Keith would have been Leo, and you would have been Josh Lyman.
probably so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, put it in terms everybody can understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're talking about that big agenda that
Mm-hmm.
you know, and you're overseeing all of this, you know, and you obviously have a great staff on hand and stuff. But the priority was the lottery and Hope Scholarship.
Well, Hope, you know, wasn't named yet. I mean, we hadn't
that's
labeled.
right,
You know,
that's right.
that didn't come about really until I think the year of the lottery referendum.
Yeah.
And we were
It was
talking
in a
about
speech at some point,
Yeah,
I think.
yeah. So it was then focused on, because in the '90 campaign we talked about you know, the pre-K and scholarships and several things, but the focus was on getting the constitutional amendment drafted, and then the legislation to create the lottery authority, lottery commission, and because Zell was determined that the money from the lottery wouldn't go into the general fund, it would only go to new programs, and so there was a lot of attention to how do you write a constitutional amendment to make sure that works that way. And Cindy Wright was great about that, and so we spent a lot of time on that. She did the lion's share of work on that legislation, on the constitutional amendment and Keith was very involved in that. So that was a big part of the focus. But then all these other items that we wanted to do too. We had an initiative around, you know, acquiring more public lands and all the other. I think we had like 40 bills each of our first 3 years in the governor's office, and so. That's a lot to manage and to get done and to see through the development and passage process.
Well, I think we have a book upstairs. I think Dan Ebersol and his wife put together was it signed, sealed, and delivered?
Yeah, that's right.
And you just go through year by year.
Yeah.
The bills that passed, the bills that failed, and it's a really great resource for that time period. Yeah. Georgia Research Alliance was also something that came up during, and that's sort of similar, but sort of. Tell me the origin of that and why that was created.
Yeah,
when
and it
did.
predated us. It had been
Yeah.
it had already been founded, and it was a private group. Tom Cousins was very involved in it, and he and Zell were good friends. And Cousins was the kind of one that put it on Zell's radar and said, we ought to think about this. And so we met with them. Bill Todd, who ran it during the '90 campaign, became aware of it. It wasn't much at that point. It didn't really have much of a focus or much funding. But it fit with Zell's worldview about you've got to invest in education if you're going to advance your economy. And that was what his focus was, and he believed in that. He believed in it with his heart and soul, which is why he cared about pre-kindergarten and the Hope Scholarship. And so, you know, it really became around, okay, we've got to invest in kids, get them ready for school. We're going to invest to try to make sure our best high school graduates don't go out of state, that they stay here. So that was what Hope was all about. And then we need to hire the best scholars, you know, in certain fields that can help promote economic growth and development here. And that all sort of fit in his mind. You know, the GRA fit in his mind as part of a strategy. And there'd been a little bit of that. You know, the CCRC had come here in the mid-'80s. It wasn't part of GRA. It predated that, but I think Cousins was involved in recruiting them and getting them here. And that effort around, you know, let's invest in scholars who are going to come in and work on things that ultimately will have an economic impact, fit with what his strategy was around. You've got to invest in education if you're going to bring an economy forward and advance it forward from where it is. And so that it fit with that.
This is jumping ahead considerably, and it's asking you to sort of bring in your experience here at UGA and also at the USG, but how much of what we see and experience at the USG level with higher education in Georgia is thanks to the policies that were implemented in that first and second Miller administration?
You know, I think there's some impact. I think mostly around hope, because I do think it's just made a big difference, not just in the image of the state and the system, but in the reality of quality and the emphasis on quality and raising standards. The hiring of Steve Porch as chancellor made a big difference in '94, I think was when he was hired. It was just something, southern states, let's face it, were not known for their commitment to public education of any kind. And you're from Illinois, you're from the Midwest, you look at all those great public flagships, they've got huge endowments. And, it was just the culture there, and some of it was where the people were from. And,
the Yale band that came through the Midwest from Connecticut.
You look at Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois,
Wisconsin.
Ohio State, Wisconsin, Michigan. These great public flagships had large endowments. They've been that way for years. You see it on the West Coast. You see it in the Northeast, mosely private institutions.
Sure.
And in the South, North Carolina was the exception, University of North Carolina. And, for Zell, he wanted to change that landscape. And let's just be honest, in 1985 or 1990, there was not a great university in the university system of Georgia. There just wasn't. There was, a good one, maybe two, but there was a good one. Georgia Tech probably was good, a good regional, but it wasn't a great international institution by any means. And
right.
So you've got to invest, and you've got to have a belief that quality matters and make decisions around investing in quality to lift it all up, and it takes a lot of time to do that.
Do you think, and maybe this isn't really a yes or no question, and maybe it's a matter of degrees, but do you think, was Zell Miller the trendsetter in setting the expectation for that you had the investment in Carl Sanders'
right.
time, sort of in the physical plant.
Yeah.
You go over to, turn around here, psychology, journalism plaza.
Yeah.
Lester Maddox, for all his faults, invested in faculty at the universities.
Yeah, absolutely.
But was Zell Miller a departure and a trendsetter in the terms that you're talking about, in terms of investment or maybe scale of investment?
I think scale certainly, and I think a deliberateness about it.
Sure.
And making connecting the dots about it. I think Carl Sanders was the first governor to plant the cultural flag, saying this matters.
Yeah.
We can't. This is probably too harsh, but we just simply can't stand and be proud of our ignorance and promote our ignorance, and that's how we're going to make it in the next 50 years. And he promoted it. He didn't say it that way, but his basically was, this matters, and we've got to invest in it. And I think that was a departure of leadership that is pretty dramatic in our state. And there were other southern states where you began to see governors do that. Sure. Because it's 100 years after the Civil War, and the average per capita incomes are 65-70% of the national average, and it's just right. a really abysmal. So you had a generation of governors in the 60s and 70s that came along, Lamar Alexander, William Winter, these guys, and Zell saw himself in that tradition, and I think built on that tradition, and I think learned from that tradition. Well, I guess I could call it a tradition, but. And I think took it to a new level, though, and by then was able to look at very specific things that he felt like if we as a state invested in and promoted, that would make a huge difference.
Right. So we mentioned reapportionment and redistricting earlier. That's something that came up a number of times during Zell's time as governor with the Larios case and others. But what was that first experience like dealing with, obviously the General Assembly has the prerogative to do this, but also dealing with legislative leadership, but also dealing with the Bush 41 Justice Department, which was really working very much hand in glove with the Georgia Republican Party. And then also the Legislative Black Caucus had an outsized role in
Yeah.
you know, how that all played out. But tell me about your perspective and your experience with that.
Yeah. Well, we didn't get involved.
Really?
Yeah, we did not get involved. And the governor told us, he called us in and said, it's the legislature's prerogative, it is poisonous, and you let them do it. And that's the word he used. And he threatened us, you stay out of it. And they would try to drag him in, and he didn't want any part of it. Because he knew how poison it was going to be at the time, for all the reasons you just outlined. And the Justice Department was working with the Legislative Black Caucus while they were working with the Republican Party. And then, of course, that all got thrown out, and we wound up doing it 2 or 3 times. But we didn't, we just didn't get involved. Now, I think one of the last redos, which might have been in 94, 95.
I think 94, 95.
He was probably a little bit more involved at that point, because it just becomes such a mess, and the legislature was almost incapable of functioning at that point around it. And there'd been some court cases, and the Attorney General Mike Bowers was, in the middle of it, and so. But on a day-to-day basis, in that 91 special session, we spent all our time and capital on the budget.
You had other things to worry about.
And the last thing we wanted was the two of them getting intertwined.
Right, because that, I assume that was the primary fear of the governor, was that this could sink the budget, the amendment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just by angering the wrong people.
Yeah, and so, and the budget was a mess, and it was, it was one of the first times, maybe the first time in a while, where we'd had this kind of, periodic decline and revenue shortfall, where the governor said, I'm not going to raise taxes. We're going to do it through cuts. And it was loud and painful, and we managed to work out what we wanted to do in the budget prior to the special session. And with just a couple of changes, it kind of sped through. And most of the time was spent on reapportionments, and we were able then to also focus on the next year and the lottery and everything. But we didn't, we didn't get involved, and it was a mess, and it was a lot of tension around race within the Democratic Party. Republicans were, understandably so, looking to take advantage of that, and so it was just a mess.
Right. Well, speaking of the parties, how much interaction did? One of the things in Georgia politics is what is the Democratic Party of Georgia? Was the governor and the governor's mansion. What sort of interaction did you or the office have with the Democratic Party organization? Of course, this was the time when Governor Miller would have appointed the chair of who I think was Ed Sims.
Ed Sims,
that first term, and then John Blackman.
John Blackman for a little while.
The second term.
And then Michael Coles for a little while.
Yeah.
I remember.
Calvin Smyrie.
He was there. I'm not sure when that was. After my time, I don't.
That would have been at Cal.
Yeah, that might have been during Governor Barnes. I don't remember.
And then Bobby Kahn.
Yeah, Bobby. Yeah.
But that was a very different Democratic Party, especially after 2002.
Yeah.
But how much interaction did you have with the party organization, such as it was?
Not a lot.
Yeah.
Really not a lot at all. I mean, it didn't really impact anything that we did or the governor did or drive policy, or it just wasn't that kind of an entity. As the laws changed, I mean, it became a fundraising vehicle.
Right.
But with, at that time, buying television ads was really how you drove the electorate. You didn't drive it through organizing at the time, and that has changed again.
Yeah, that's sort of flipped back.
It's flipped back. So, I went to 2 state Democratic conventions because I had to, in 90 and 94, and nothing like the national party where there was just it's just kind of this massive bureaucratic entity that you deal with.
Right.
So We just didn't, Keith dealt with Ed a good bit and,
Yeah.
strategizing around, the 92 race and all that. I didn't really get too involved in any of that.
So you weren't riding on the bus from Hawkinsville to Valdosta?
I didn't do any of that. I stayed back and, we worked on the day-to-day stuff. So I went to
Somebody had to
a few
mind the
things.
store, I
Yeah, I went
guess.
to. I mean, I could have gone. I could have participated in anything I wanted to.
Did you go up to New York to the Democratic?
I did.
National
Yeah,
Convention?
that was great
Okay.
fun. Yeah, that was a great experience.
I was going to say, surely you didn't turn that one.
No, it was a great experience. No, I could have been involved in anything I wanted to be, and was some of it. And we were back at home, and my wife was pregnant with our first child, so we. I paid some attention to that too.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. It's important.
Yeah.
So what insight can you, and maybe this is probably more of a Keith question perhaps, but what insights can you give into Governor Miller's relationship with then Governor, later President Clinton?
Yeah, and Keith would have some on that, but they knew one another, and I remember the first time I met Bill Clinton, we were at the new governors conference that the National Governors Association did. It was in Louisville, Kentucky in November of 1990. Clinton came over and we were, me and Keith, I guess Howard Meade, I don't remember who all had gone, 3 or 4 or 5 of us. We were sitting there at a table eating something, and he came over and sat down and chit-chatted, and, it was pretty obvious that, he was working everybody and was probably going to run in 92. And so they, and I guess in the fall of 91, Bill Clinton spoke at Zell's invitation to would it have been the Richard Russell dinner? Yeah, Jefferson Jackson was in the
Richard
February,
Russell would have been the county. The
Yeah,
county
that's right,
parties,
yeah. He spoke to that, and it was sort of obvious he needed some help, and there were conversations around he needs to get James and Paul and together, but and they just sort of hit it off. I think Clinton looked up to Zell in many ways, had genuine affection for one another and respect for one another. Mm-hmm. And Zell was very, very supportive of him, obviously.
Sure.
And helped him a great deal in the 92 race.
Right. So at some point, you make a little bit of an escape from the governor's office to Georgia State or somewhere in academia. You made
Georgia State.
You tried to you tried to slip out.
Yeah, I tried to.
How'd that come about?
Yeah. I thought, got a young child, and it seemed like a good time to maybe strike off in a different direction. And then, of course, Clinton got elected, and it didn't last. I think it only lasted 6 months. So, and Keith went to the White House as he should have. That was a great opportunity for him. And so I remember Virgil Williams was the one that called me and wanted to have lunch and asked if I'd come back. I talked to my wife and said sure.
What was Virgil's role?
And he, of course, was kind of I don't know what his title was in the campaign, but he was kind of the main guy and just brought so much credibility to the whole thing and to Zell with the business community that he probably didn't have. And he was honorary chief of staff, I think maybe we called him in the governor's office, which governors had done. Maybe Busby started it, I don't remember. And so, but he was obviously very close to all of us and to Zell, and I think Zell, I don't know this for a fact, but knowing Zell, I think Zell probably said, well, you go ask him if he'll do it. So Virgil and I had lunch, and I said yes. So
clearly successful in luring you back. So you came back originally as chief of staff, but then I'm trying to picture the page in the Ebersol book, because there's a time you were temporary chief of staff, and I think maybe Dan Ebersol.
I came back as chief of staff when Keith left to go to the White House, which was May or so, 93.
Yeah.
And I was chief of staff, and then in the summer and fall of 94, I forget, maybe June of 94, I went off the state payroll, took a leave of absence, and became chief of staff at the campaign.
That's right. Okay.
And Dan was, I don't know, we called him interim chief of staff or whatever. And then after the campaign, I went back as chief of staff in the governor's office.
So 94, comparing 94 to 1990, what was different?
Zell was highly vulnerable. And we knew he was highly vulnerable. And he decided to run for re-election knowing he was highly vulnerable. We'd done a poll in the summer of 93, late summer or maybe early fall, and our pollster, Alan Sechrist, who was really, really good, we had a meeting around the poll, and he just basically said, your chances are maybe 50-50 of winning re-election.
It's not good for an incumbent.
No, it's not, and some of it was the flag, but some of it was
the flag.
Some of it was the economic conditions. Some of it was, it just always happens. Zell had developed this kind of national profile around Clinton and such, and
the nationalization of politics.
Yeah,
Democratic president.
And Clinton, struggled, that first couple of years. And so there was just a lot of things, and the economy was just still kind of dragging. And
so a lot of headwinds.
A lot of headwinds. That's a good way to put it. And so he was vulnerable. He was very vulnerable, which was the reverse of 90, because he was the guy to beat in 90. And, he would have had to stumble badly to lose in 90.
Yeah.
So that was the big difference, and a lot of just angst and anger, and you had a lot of things happening nationally that people were concerned about and unnerved about. You had the riots in L.A. and all that stuff, and so there's just a lot at work that didn't bode well for incumbents, and a lot of them lost in the 94s. Lawton Childs barely squeaked by, and Richards got beat.
Right. Right.
So he was very vulnerable going into that 94 re-elect.
So Carville wasn't part of the 94 re-elect.
Just on the edge, not much.
So Jim Andrews. Was brought.
Yeah, who he and Paul had recommended.
Okay, so tell me about the difference between James Carville and Jim Andrews and your relationship, your working relationship with them.
Yeah, well, in '94, I was. I was chief of staff of the campaign, so I was sort of I was the main guy with respect to the Miller people, because others had moved on, and so it was. And Jim was the consultant, who's just a genius. But I dealt with James a lot in '90, but not in the way that Keith did.
Right.
And Jim is very, very bright. But he's from the Chicago area or maybe upstate New York, one of those, and didn't, always have the kind of softness that or the roundness about him that James understood Zell, and a Southerner, and just understood him and knew how to kind of navigate with him, and because Zell was tough, and it was can be tough to deal with, and so Jim, they would butt heads more directly because Jim, probably from his own personality, but they loved each other and they got along great, and Zell understood this guy knows what he's talking about. He could read a poll and he could devise a strategy, and was really, really good at it. But I would say the difference is they were both very, very good at the campaign strategizing and designing it and putting it into effect, and developing media and the polling and all of that. The difference was more just the kind of people that they were,
sure.
and both were very successful, and both wound up having very close relationships with Zell and the team.
So, talk about the strategy in 1990. You had the blueprint for the 1990s. You had this positive program. In '94, how was the strategy different? What was that big idea that you could offer for that second term, or was it lots of look at what we've done, look at who we're running against?
Yeah.
Or I assume some mixture of both.
Yeah. It's always a mixture of both.
Yeah.
And we were lucky in ~94. I say lucky, I don't know what the word is, because Zell was vulnerable, but we drew a really bad candidate. I mean, Guy Milner was just, I'm not talking personally, he was just a bad candidate.
Well, I interviewed Guy.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
A few years ago, and he, that first campaign, he made he admitted making a lot of mistakes that a first time. Yeah. Not amateur, excuse me. A newcomer, a novice candidate makes.
He did, and so that helped us a lot. But our approach to the campaign was, when you're asking people to put you in a second time, there's sort of two things you got to do. Part of it is, this is what we did.
Right.
This is
the accomplishments.
This is what we've done the first time, which is one argument. Put us in again, and then to sort of talk about this is what we'll do in the second term. And, it wasn't a big idea that we organized around in the second term. It was more smaller things. Heck, I don't even remember a lot of them. But a lot of our focus became around, got the lottery done, we got the Hope Scholarship, and that became a real focal point.
Right.
And then the other things that we passed a tax cut, and we passed the tougher, sentencing laws, and all that was a piece of it. These are the things that we've done. And another element of it was to say, this governor's been around. He knows how to get stuff done. This is what he's got done, and he'll do it again. This fellow over here, he doesn't know what he's doing. He has no idea. And and Milner, they were. I think they were. I think they knew, they could win, but Again, it's a little bit like Barnes in '90. I mean, he's, because he picked out, he tried to sort of portray himself as, run it like a business, and then his own businesses were sort of, a little bit of a mess. And he said, I'm against the lottery, but he invested in casinos. And, there were these things around him that you raise questions about, is this guy really who he says he is? And so it was very close, 32,000 votes. And I think it came down to, I remember this, we were somewhere, in '94, I was with Zell a lot on the road, and we were somewhere in South Georgia, and he was off doing his thing, shaking hands somewhere, and, I'm standing in the back, and nobody knows who I am, I'm just standing there. Some guy, I hear these two people, a man and a woman talking, and he says, there's that guy, he tried to change the flag, and I just can't vote for him. And this woman says, well, you know what? He's putting my granddaughter through college, and I'm going to vote for him. And I think it kind of, I don't want to oversimplify something that's complicated, but I think for a lot of people, and newer people in Georgia, they were going to be for him because of those things he'd been doing. And so, that's what really, I think that helped him, that sort of sense around him that, well, he's not looking back, he's looking forward. I think in the end made a difference.
So, I think you touched on this, that you knew that Guy Milner could win sort of in spite of his campaign.
Yeah,
because
sure.
of
Yeah.
the metrics of the campaign,
Yeah.
and there being the Republican wave that every poll worth its salt saw coming from about August '94 forward. So I assume election night 1994 was a bit more stressful.
Oh, yeah.
Than 90.
We thought we were going to win because our last couple of pre-election polls, the Friday before.
Was Andrews as confident as Carville had been?
No, but that's a personality thing too. But I think the last poll we had hit 51. I mean, when you're polling,
incumbent, you
want to break 50 in a poll, and I remember talking to Bobby Kahn 2 or 3 months out from their reelect, and he's saying, we can't push it over 50, and so I thought,
that's a problem.
But we managed to hit 50 and push it over 50 pretty consistently the last couple of 3 weeks, and so we felt okay. But then it does become turnout. It was a long night. It was 1:30 or 2 in the morning before we declared victory, but I never thought we were going to lose. But we knew it was going to be close and knew it was going to be tough for all the reasons that we've talked about.
So, is there a transition when you win a second term, or is it just you go back to the office and say hi to the administrative assistants? And
we were up late, very late that night, and my phone rang about 6:30 or 6:45. I had a very few hours of sleep, and it was the governor. He said, come out here to the mansion, I want to talk to you. And so, because we had not talked about what I was going to do in a second term.
Okay.
Really. We knew the Olympics were coming, and because we'd already had worked a lot on that. But he said, what are you going to do? I want you to stay with me. I'd like you to stay the second term, but I want you to at least stay through the Olympics. I said, well, I'll certainly do that. So. And that was, I was at the mansion at 7:30 the next morning, and you're off to the races, and we were preparing for the '95 legislative session, and there was a lot of work around the Olympics, but there were a number of other issues too. I mean, that's just constant. You've got a state government to run, and it's just slowly dragging out of the economic situation that the country was in and the state had been in, And revenue, in the 80s, state revenue, annual revenue growth was 10, 12, 14%. And we were happy if we saw 3 or 4.
Which is obviously not sustainable.
It's not
over
sustainable.
a long
No,
term.
it's not. But we were happy if we saw 3 or 4,
Right.
and if we got a projection of a 5, we thought we were, really. But so, yeah, you immediately go back to work.
Yeah. So, and obviously you stayed for the bulk of that second term. In terms of priorities and policies, how did the second term differ from the first?
I think the first term was really because there were a lot of things they all wanted to get done, but so much of it was organized around getting the lottery up and running, getting the lottery referendum passed, getting those programs up and running.
Right.
Then the other, pieces of legislation, but then just running the government day to day, because you never know when you're going to have a flood or a tornado or a prison riot. All that gets, impinges on what you do day to day.
1993.
Yeah, with the flood of '94, Alberto.
It was 93 in southern Illinois. The Great Flood of 93.
Yeah, we had one here in '94.
Is that the Flint River?
Yeah. Alberto was the tropical storm.
Oh,
so
yeah.
all of that, and you get that in the second term, and so you deal with that. But the second term was really around. There's so much of it because that was early '95. I'd spent a great deal of time around Olympics-related matters, in addition to the usual day-to-day stuff.
But tell me about that. That's obviously a once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
And there's no blueprint for
Right,
that.
right.
I guess did you look at how Los Angeles had dealt with the Olympics? How did that work for you?
We didn't in our office because it was so very different, and a large percentage of the venues were state property.
Right.
70% or something of the events took. Of course, we leased those to the ACOG. But we worked very closely with them, and over time, my friend Billy Payne and my friend A.D. Frazier, they like to maintain this fiction that there was no public money in the Olympics, and they did a great job. I mean, it's a miracle what Billy was able to do, and it was so just enriching to the state. I don't mean monetarily, but in every way, and it really, I think, put the state on a map that it never existed. But it was as the games approached. I mean, we spent a lot of time around security issues, and more we created an organization called SOLEC, the State Olympic Law Enforcement Command, to jointly utilize all of our state law enforcement resources. We actually declared a state of emergency, which was never public, during the Olympics, so we could utilize the National Guard. So there was a lot of coordination between state and federal and local agencies, and mostly around public safety and law enforcement, because in the end, the state wound up providing the lion's share of the security for the Olympic Games.
Which of course became very public.
Yeah.
After the Centennial Park bomb.
Oh yeah, my phone went off at 1:30 in the morning, and it was Gary McConnell who was head of our SOLEC organization.
I remember waking up in the recliner in the living room, and I was like, fell asleep during some athletic event and woke up with Wolf Blitzer or somebody. I don't know if it was Wolf Blitzer, but it was maybe Bernard Shaw at that point in '96. Walk me through that. I assume you were into the office or the governor's mansion or down to headquarters with the governor?
The SOLEC command, we had a command center there, so I went there. I called the governor immediately after Gary called me, but they didn't know what had happened.
Right.
Gary said there's been an explosion.
Yeah,
and they thought maybe a light or something around the stage, and then it quickly became evident that a device had been detonated. So I immediately went to the SOLEC headquarters, and I don't know, I spent a couple of days there. I didn't go home, until we figured out, because you got all these players involved, and I think at least one person had been killed, and somebody died of a heart attack, and it was just tragic and awful. And so we were on the phone. This guy, Al Gore, who was vice president, oversaw kind of the federal role in the Olympic planning, and so his office. Then Ron Klain was his chief of staff, and so we worked with Ron, and we all got on the telephone, and there's people from the International Olympic Committee and ACOG, a bunch of us on the phone, and we're trying to figure out what to do. Do you stop the games? Do you pause the games? What do you do? And the International Olympic Committee people they're very impressed with themselves, and they don't think there's anything else in the world except the Olympic Games, and they were not an impressive group of people, but they were impressed with themselves, shall I put it that way. So this guy on the phone, I forget who it was. It wasn't the main guy, but he was like the number 2 guy. It's all about the Olympics, and so a couple of us had to remind him that people had been hurt and people had been killed, and maybe we ought to think that part through. And so, there was a lot of focus around that, and then safety issues, and then, okay, what do we do? It's public property in the end. How do you, do if you heighten security and ask people to go through magnetometers? How do you do that? And Mike Bauer was a big help on that because the U.S. Justice Department, they were wringing their hands and they were all tangled up in themselves. What do you do? And so we had to work through a lot of issues because we pretty quickly said, we're going to pause the games, but we got to restart. And so there was an effort around, the FBI was conducting the investigation of the bombing and who did it, and the GBI, and so we didn't have to really get into all that, but it was mostly around, what do we do with the games, how do we restart, and how do we make sure we're safe. Mm-hmm. But going in, it was really interesting. I attended a briefing that the FBI did on pre-Olympic security. This is like 4 or 5 days before the games. That it was the ACOG leadership. I was there, just a handful of us. And the guy's name was Woody Johnson. He was head of the FBI office in Atlanta. And, they just kind of went through all the stuff that they had done and they were looking at and they were monitoring. At the time, it was Libya and all these other, He basically said, we're not worried about any state-sponsored terrorism. He said, what we're worried about, and it's the hardest to account for, is some lone guy. And, which turned out to be the case.
Lo and behold.
Yeah, so... But, it was exhausting and it was tiring, and it was tiring anyway. I was exhausted before the bomb went off. It was a good effort by everybody. And then we had a sort of a relaunch, had a ceremony at Centennial Olympic Park, and Andy Young spoke. It was just brilliant. He just did a brilliant job and put the whole thing in context, and we kicked it off again, and so it was a tragic thing and it's sad, but we sort of managed through it and kept focus on, I think, the right thing, which is get people safe, be sympathetic and understand what happened, but this is a big deal. Let's try to move forward with it in the right way.
Did you ever watch that Clint Eastwood movie about Richard Jewell?
I never did.
Probably be quite triggering for
I've actually, because was it Ken Alexander that wrote a book about it, I think?
I believe so.
Yeah, I've not read his book. Kent was U.S. Attorney. But that was that whole thing was kind of there was a rush to judgment around that clearly a rush to judgment.
Right.
And a lot of sloppy media work. I mean, it's just unfortunate, but it was. So.
Right.
But I've not watched that. I need to, I guess. I forgot that thing was out there.
Right. Well, I just thought about it, having this conversation. So what's it like working in a lame duck executive's office, as you're winding down and everybody, you still have this job that's still very important and is no less busy than when you started, but all the focus and attention is on who's coming next.
It's good.
Oh yeah.
It's and I knew I wasn't going to try to stay in that arena. I was going to go do something else, and I'd worked for Zell Miller for almost 10 years at that point, and you get into 97, early 98, and I was ready to, go do something else. And but the job still carries on. There's a lot to do. You're still running a big, complicated state. You're still trying to, recruit industry, and you're trying to make sure everything works. And so it's very busy every day. And we had we had conscious conversations around, as governor, he was going to be out there. And he was going to continue to be governor until the last day, and he was going to go around the state and visit and make appearances and remind people and keep working. Because that's how he was cut out, and I think the team was cut out that way. You don't have the pressure of worrying about a reelect, so that's nice. And it gives you a little bit of freedom, but you know, the day-to-day stuff doesn't stop. But it was fun. I told Governor and Marty Kemp, Mrs. Kemp, last fall. I saw them at an event. It was in the Regents related event, and we were chatting. And I said, "You're going to like a second term." I said, you know, and Marty was like, "I hope so," you know, because like, you know, campaigns are tough. I told him, second terms are good. You know, they're fun, and they're, you know, you can get some things done. You got to keep your eye on the ball. But and so I think that was you know, Zell stayed out there, and he kept working to the very end, and I think that made a big difference in because he never really had a bad lame duck session. He never really reached a point. Because he was a pretty strong governor and knew how to pull the levers and was out there and became very popular by the end of the second term.
Sure.
I mean, you know, the approval ratings were 80 in the 80s, as I recall. And so he was very popular, and all that really helped. And so it was, you know, it was good. But, you know, I remember the morning after the end of the 1998 legislative session, which was his last and my last, you know, working for him, and 5:30 the next morning, you know, my phone rings. There had been a terrible tornado in Gainesville. So we had to get on a helicopter and go. Mm-hmm. And that's just how it is, you know.
Right.
We had a great session. Everybody's feeling good. It's like, wow, you know, look, we've got, okay, now we've checked all the boxes, and you get up, you know, and that's the way the work is.
No rest for the wicked.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But it's good. It's not I never considered it a negative at all.
So, you know, there was, as the governor's time in office was winding down, you're moving over to the University of Georgia. The governor's going to teach at the university and some other teaching posts. And then Senator Coverdell passes away suddenly, July 2000. Mm-hmm. Were you privy to any of the conversations that led to his appointment to fill that Senate seat in 2000?
Yeah, we talked a lot. And I know Keith did as well. Yeah, we talked a lot. And, you know, I didn't see, because I was here, I'd been here 2 years.
Okay,
by the time that occurred, because I came to the university in July of '98. But I had just started in July of 2000, literally just started as VP of Government Relations.
Yeah.
And so we talked a lot. And, you know, and I told him, I said, you know, I'm not going to, if you ask me, I'll make a recommendation about what I think you ought to do, but I'm just here to help you think it through.
Right.
And so we talked a lot about it, you know, and, you know, in the end, I think he felt like, he just felt the pull of the governor of the state of Georgia was asking him to do something, and he felt like he should do it. And I think that's kind of why he did it in the end. But he had doubts about it, about whether or not he ought to do it. And I think several of us had doubts about whether or not he ought to do it. He never liked Washington. We'd go up there, you know, for Governors Association NGA meetings, and that just kind of wasn't his thing. And it's, you know, he likes to get stuff done, you know, and he's an executive branch guy. And, you know, and Washington is sort of the opposite of that, you know. It's all
especially
about,
now.
Oh, yeah, and it was, you know, it's just all about positioning, and some people would say preening, and he doesn't care about, you know, all of that. He just wants to get something done. So, you know, in the end, it probably wasn't a good fit for him. But you know, he thought a lot about it, and then finally decided to accept the appointment.
So if he had, or if he did ask you yes or no, would you have told him no, that he shouldn't?
You know, it's hard for me to answer that now. I'm trying to think back 23 years ago. I think I was sort of leaning against it, you know, and I don't want to put myself in a position like I knew better, you know.
Sure.
And I don't think it was a waste or a bad thing at all for him in the end, but I just sort of at the time remember, you know, more than one conversation around it, and I reminded him, you don't like Washington, you don't like going up there, and you don't like, you know, all that stuff that you have to do. And he, you know, he had a lot of day. I remember he told me one time. He said, you know, I've been everywhere I want to go, and I've met everybody I want to meet. But you know, I respected him and still do, and honor that tug for him of they're asking me to do something for my state, and I should go do it. And I think that's what did it in the end. But I honestly don't know what I would have said, because I don't. It's all colored by history now,
Sure,
you know.
sure.
And I could say, oh, I'd have said to him, you ought not to go up there, but I'm not sure what I would have said if he had said, what do you think I ought to do?
My first exposure to Georgia politics and Zell Miller, it was one and the same, was my freshman year of college, and I was watching the Republican National Convention.
Oh boy, yeah.
On MSNBC.
04, I guess.
In 04, as all the cool kids were doing in their dorm rooms, and I saw this white-haired senator from Georgia just going after Chris Matthews.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're very close to the Miller family for a number of different reasons. What was your take on what you saw on national TV and sort of that national conversation surrounding this senator from Georgia, and your sort of first reactions to like?
Yeah, you know, and before because the Matthews thing was after his speech, is that right? I'm trying to remember.
It had to have been after. It had to have been the day after the speech, because you wouldn't roll a keynoter out like that.
Yeah.
It had to have been after.
Yeah. So I remember talking to him before his speech. I don't know if it wasn't the day of, I don't think, but you know, I told him, I said, don't let them just send you out there and be the attack dog. Don't, you know, because I sort of felt like I didn't know I was not on the inside, had no idea what, you know, we were friends, and you know, and you know, Shirley later told me that you know, he had a speech and they kept whittling it down until it became, you know, what it was, which was nothing more than an attack, and a mean-spirited attack, and you know, but you know, he's a big boy, he's a grown man, and he let it become that, and so I you know, I don't know if he ever regretted it. I wasn't going to, you know, I loved the man. I wasn't going to question that or try to make him feel bad about it. But I was concerned mostly how it would affect his legacy here. And that and the Matthews thing. And, you know, Matthews he's a talking head on a television show. That's what he's supposed to do.
He was a provocateur.
Yeah, that's what they get paid to do. And you know that going in. And so
the show was called Hardball for a
yeah,
reason.
you know, and you know, we later did a thing here when Mike Adams was president around the 30th anniversary of Jimmy Carter's inauguration in 07, I guess it would have been. And Chris Matthews came.
Yeah.
And I wound up sitting next to him at a dinner, and we were talking about Zell. And he was talking about how great Zell is, you know, but I just think it was a timing thing, and you know, he might have been tired. There might have been a lot of things at work, but that was my big concern: is what is it going to do to the man's legacy as governor, who achieved so much and done so much to put the state on a different path, and you know, I don't know what it did, if anything, maybe nothing.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about that, you know, as I was preparing, you know, for this interview, as you know, especially those who are really politically minded. I think that there's a very conscious sort of firewall between Governor Zell Miller and what he accomplished, and then this sort of outlier experience from 2000, not even really 2000, but 2004.
Yeah.
You know, now obviously there was the departure over the tax cuts and everything, but he was hardly the only conservative Democrat to make that break. But yeah, that's my sense anyway of sort of the legacy.
I hope that's the case. Probably should be the case. And I do think, you know, I think he got to Washington, and I think he just felt like, you know, because he was, like I said, he was a guy who wanted to get stuff done. He wasn't really partisan. he knew George Bush because they'd been governors together. He liked him, and George Bush respected him and paid him respect, probably more so than some of those Democratic Senate leaders did. You know, the Robert Byrds of the world and those guys that, you know, basically were like, you know, just sit down and shut up. Well, you don't, that's not, they didn't say that, but that's the attitude, you know. You sit over there in the corner, well, you don't do that to a guy who's done, you know, what Zell Miller has done. He's done a lot more than Robert Byrd had done, you know, and so you don't do that. And the poor old Tom Daschle and those guys, they just didn't know how to deal with him, you know, and so, you know.
Zell Miller didn't come with a manual of
yeah, you
how
know,
to handle him.
You know, and he's sort of straightforward. He wasn't going to just, oh, I've got a D by my name, then I'm voting with Daschle. That's not how it worked with him. Phil Gramm, you know, reached out to him and really cultivated a really warm and friendly relationship with him, and the Bush people did, and I think he developed probably more trust with them than he did with some of the Democratic Senate leaders who were thinking more partisan, because I think they really sort of thought, well, he's on our team, he's got to do what we say, and you just, you know, he's not cut out like that, and governors aren't
A very
cut out
parliamentary mindset. You know, there's a three-line whip, and of course, you know, you're gonna.
Yeah. It just wasn't his cup of tea, you know.
Right.
I mean, I'd go up there to see him. It was because he's very, you know, he's very time management oriented. And well, if you're going to be a United States senator, you're not going to be time management oriented. So.
It sounds absolutely miserable. and you know, you spent lots of time with him in his retirement. When he was reflecting and thinking back, was it primarily talking about the governor's mansion and
That's
state
what we,
government?
yeah.
Or
but there were some wonderful moments from when he was in the Senate, and so he would, you know, think about some of those. And it is a historic place and historic role. I think it was great for his family and his, you know, and to be able to be there and be in that wonderful town and all that it offers. And so there were a lot of positives about it. But yeah, because I had worked with him in the governor's office,
Yeah.
that's what we, you know, that's what we would talk. But you know, we didn't really talk about that. We didn't, you know, we would talk about whatever I was doing now, and you know, the kids and whatever they're doing and whatever else, the Braves. You know, it's just. He's just not a guy he was to look back and sort of rehash things, and we just didn't do a lot of that when we would talk or get together. So now I'd always call him on election night, you know, and we would talk during election night about stuff, and that was always fun. So whatever, you know, up really probably 2014 for sure. 2016, you know, he'd begun to, you know, experience some issues with the Parkinson's Lewy bodies, but yeah, I would always talk to him on election night. So
right, because 2014, I remember that was sort of his last foray into indoor. And I remember back to back one time, and I don't know if this is purposeful or, you know, if Bobby had bought the time slots on purpose, but. There he was endorsing Michelle Nunn.
Yeah.
And then 30 seconds later endorsing Governor Deal.
Yeah. Well, he and Governor Deal went way back.
Well, sure.
And had always been close, and Governor Deal's very respectful toward him, and they, you know, that was just kind of a natural thing. And you know, I don't know that I even know the story on the Michelle Nunn endorsement. I think she got in the car and rode up there and asked him, and he said okay. I think that's how that came about. I really do. And she's impressive, you know, and she's really smart and very capable. And I think that's how that happened. I think she went up there and asked him. I don't think it was her dad. I think it was she went up there and said, this is why. That's kind of the story that they told me. So
as I was saying, we'll talk about your time as chancellor at a later date, because that you know, there's plenty of things we can talk about, from consolidation to COVID-19 to everything in between. But thinking back on you know, your time in state government, you know, what's your takeaway now as you're at the end of your career in retirement, thinking about what you got out of state government and what you remember and what you want your legacy, not just the legacy of Zell Miller, to be, but what's Steve Wrigley's legacy and impact in state government?
Well, to me, it was a wonderful opportunity on one level, but you know, it was, and I told this to the board, and it was a privilege. You know, it's a privilege to be in roles like that, and I never took any of it for granted. I got to work with some wonderful people. Not just the people with the big names, but just colleagues that I either worked for or they worked for me, became friends. Public sector work, it's much harder than private sector work. It is dramatically harder. It's exponentially harder now than it was, particularly if you're in any kind of a senior role or
Everybody's a shareholder when it's public affairs.
yeah, and they all know more than you do, and that's fair. It's fair. But the scrutiny level, and the media has just gotten so bad that only because they have to compete for clicks and market share and all that, that all they care about is what they know is going to get, some sort of elevated, reaction. Right. So the scrutiny levels, it's just a much harder work. And then you roll into that, 20 years of fairly restricted revenue growth, and it's tough. And you see it, this is a wonderful place and a wonderful institution and a great library, but y'all feel the strains of it, and every public entity of every kind in our state and nation feel it all the time. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. And I came through at a time when a lot of those trends sort of began, but it was still wonderful work. You could make a difference. I never sort of, because I never had my name on a ballot, never wanted to. And I was very respectful of that. So I never saw my job as pursuing what I cared about. When I became chancellor, there was more of that. But I still was hired by a board and worked for, ultimately elected officials. But you get a job like that, and it is your role to drive the agenda, and along with a bunch of people. But it really is. I have sort of an old-fashioned view of public service, I think, because of my parents and what they did, it's a great country and a great state, and it's done a lot for me. You want to give back, and one way you give back is through your public service. That's the things I tried to convey to people that work for me. Is you work hard, and be ethical around it. Be straight with people, and then pick some things and try to get some things done. I think there's a lot of things I feel good about having been a part of through many years. Helping a little bit on Hope and a few other things, and even little things like the Tallulah Gorge, what is now Tallulah Gorge State Park, being very involved in that. Stuff like that. But more than anything, in my role in the system office is really placing an emphasis on increasing graduation rates or increasing completion rates. And we moved the needle. You could see the numbers change. And that really mattered to me. And over a period of years, we were able to do that. And I just think that, I think we have to maintain standards, and it ought to be hard to get a degree, but I don't believe in this wash people out sort of mentality. If we're going to admit them, we need to, try to help them, and if they do their part, then we ought to do our part, because ultimately it's good for them, it's good for the state, and it just makes all the difference in the world for somebody to be able to complete a degree. So that was one of the things we really focused on, and we moved the numbers, and I felt good about that. But it's I don't think I'm not a person that thinks about his legacy or what that ought to be. I'll let that be to others. But I've got a lot of friends, and I still stay in touch with a lot of them, and I reflect on that now that I'm retired, and I think, wow, I know a lot of people I get to go to lunch with and meet with and have fun with, and that to me is, I don't know if that's a legacy or not, but it is a reward for me to be able to just to get with friends over many, many, many years. I've been friends with Keith Mason going on 40 years now, and that's really that sort of thing is special in ways that you can't really sort of quantify.
Right. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it, and let's go have lunch with some of those friends.
Oh yeah,
right
absolutely.
Now.
Yeah,
So
thank you
so much on behalf of the Russell Library and the University of Georgia.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciated the time.
Thank you very much.